Hey there, Aaron here, and first of all, I just want to say that I hope you are all safe and healthy. I know it's a very scary time and that this current pandemic is a huge adjustment, especially for those with compromised immune systems and underlying health issues. I'm going on my third week of being on lockdown, and I dearly miss family, friends, and my coworkers, and I miss such mundane things such as just dropping by my favorite ramen place on a whim. Second, I recorded 8 Hall H Show episodes late last year before the coronavirus pandemic hit, featuring Omar Mora, Christy Shin, Rylan Grant, Tony Fabro, Lord Mesa, June Izzy Inocencio, Trevor Frick, and my guest for episode 84, Charlie Stickney, the writer and creator of the fantasy / romance / horror comic White Ash. Unfortunately, pre-coronavirus, work and quite a few side projects had taken up quite a bit of my time, but since I have more time now these days, I'll be launching all of these episodes soon. I enjoyed my conversation with Charlie, as he has a way of speaking, a cadence, a style that accentuates his sincerity. If you follow him online or know him personally, you can tell that he cares. He cares about creating a great story, great value, and he also wants to make sure that you succeed as well. Lots of gold in this episode, from talking about his early love of Lord of the Rings, Sword of Shanarra, and the Transformers cartoon and comic book series, to succeeding at creating a comic book, building a fan base, and funding Kickstarter campaigns, all while raising a family. Speaking of Kickstarter campaigns, his comic book, White Ash, has an active campaign going on that ends on April 8th, 2020, so please go check it out. White Ash is an ongoing comic series that features art and letters by Conor Hughes, colors by Fin Cramb, and it's created and written by my guest, Charlie Stickney. Thanks again for listening to my conversation with Charlie, and please be safe and healthy out there. Hey there, Hall H Show listeners. Aaron Nabus here, and I'm happy to welcome on the show Charlie Stickney. He's the writer and creator of the indie comic book White Ash. White Ash is a refreshing take on the fantasy genre, and I love the tagline for it. The smaller the town, the bigger the secrets. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Usually I like to start off the show with a sort of like an origin story, because all our heroes have origin stories, right? So why don't you let our audience know where you grew up and maybe what you were into when you were 11 years old?
What I was into when I was 11 years old? Well, I mean, I grew up in New England, rural New England. I moved from a town of about 10,000 to a town of 7,000. So I actually come from a small town myself. And but it was a nice place to live as opposed to a coal mining town. I was in our beach community in southern Maine, which was really nice. When I was 11, let's see, I was actually reading a lot of Lord of the Rings at that time, maybe some Terry Brooks, Sword of Shannara, and just getting into comic books. For me, the gateway was the Transformers cartoon, the 1980s.
Oh, nice.
And I loved that cartoon, and they had this comic book series, Marvel did, with the Transformers, and I think I was in a Bradley's, which was a department store that I don't think is around anymore, and they had this 3-pack of Transformers comics, and so I was like, oh, Transformers, it was number 1, 2, and 3, reprints, but still, it was numbers 1, 2, and 3, and in the 3rd issue, Spider-Man made an appearance. And he was in this black suit, and I had no idea what that was about, because I kind of knew Spider-Man from Spider-Man Is Amazing Friends, and I really wanted to know what was going on with Spider-Man. So it was my gateway drug. So I went from those 3. I went to the comic, I went to actually a bookstore, because there weren't that many comic book stores there. especially in rural Maine. And I grabbed Amazing Spider-Man. I think it was 287, which was right in the middle of this gang war series. And Daredevil made an appearance, and the Punisher made an appearance. So then I had to find out who this Daredevil person was, and it snowballed. And pour a story about how I got hooked into comics at an early age.
Nice. Now, when did you think, or when did you sort of feel that you got that spark to become a writer? Is there a particular moment in time where that happened for
Well,
you?
I think I always wanted to be a writer. When I was in middle, I mean, I've always been writing short stories and things like that from middle school through high school. And when I was in college, I thought I was going to be a comic book writer at that point. But I was also a film major. And I was kind of weighing the two different options between two unrealistic careers. So especially coming from me. But I interned at Marvel and saw that side of things. And but then when I was a senior in college, I was offered a job in Los Angeles in the film industry, and so I ended up coming out to LA. But it was to be a writer, a director, a producer, to do all those things. And then I ended up in animation for a while. Been working as a writer, just in different mediums. And, over the last couple of years, I've finally been able to come back to what I started out trying to do, and working in comic books.
What time period was that when you I guess from college to when you made your way to LA?
90s. No, that's the one that you saw, or uh, I did a detective noir parody film that I wrote and directed, and that was in the late 90s. Yeah, and so I can send you a copy of that. But then from there, I turned it into, yeah, yeah. That it was a detective noir parody, and but with mystical undertones, and I turned that into a web comic, and then I turned that into a screenplay, and that screenplay was one of the things that helped get me my first writing job. Um, the thing about the entertainment industry is very often the things that you write are not the things that you sell. They are the things that you get you the job writing for someone else's thing. Because companies have already invested a certain money in IP or developing an idea, and so they're often looking for writers who they think have a certain sensibility. So if they read your script and they like it, they might hire you to work on their thing versus investing money in your thing. So the Divine Intervention movie comedy, it was a very immature piece. I mean, it was something I wrote right out of college, but it had a lot of um, fun, creativity, and world building that really served me well moving into animation, which is where I started when I first came out here. And so I showed that script to the president of the animation company, the guy who owned it, and he moved me into development after that. And then I got to showrun a show and help create this series in conjunction with Scholastic, based on one of their book series called Horrible Histories.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure you've sort of parlayed your film experience to your comic books, much the same way as one of my other guests.
Sure.
He comes on the show every so often. Stefan Frank. He's the creator of Silver. He's known for being the animation director for the Iron Giant. So he's definitely parlayed his experience in the animation world into his comic books, and you can tell there's a huge difference between his comic book style and other people's. So in reading your book, White Ash, which you sort of bill, I saw your a recent tweet that says the greatest fantasy romance horror comic ever set in a coal mining town. So well, we'll talk about that soon, but. Yeah, I mean, talk about your experiences with coming up with White Ash. When did you feel like you had to get the story out of your belly?
Well, I
And
constantly
how long
have
did it take?
different ideas that are germinating, and and I'll write down a line, and then what I like to do is I think we all have different ways of procrastinating. when we're trying to do something creative. With the invention of the internet, surfing the internet becomes a really easy way to, lose lots of time. But what I try to do when I'm, looking to procrastinate is I work on one of the stories that I, am not currently writing. And so White Ash was something that I started as a procrastination, not to write this other thing that I was currently working on, actually getting paid to work on. So, and it was just kind of fun to get out there. Uh,
I can still relate. Just before we move on, it's like I'm a graphic designer by trade, but
mhm.
I'll often work on things that are unpaying gigs or just for fun before I actually start the actual paying gig, just to sort of get myself warmed up. So it's interesting that you sort of say that you start working on projects that you procrastinate on, because I'm sure that sort of working on a different project leads to different perspectives and sort of unlocks different ways of approaching things. So, is that the same for you?
Well, I think when it comes down to writing and teaching, um, because I've done a little bit of teaching. What I was going to say is, like, when you're trying to teach something to someone, you clarify it for yourself, what the rules are, what the problems are, what the issues are with something. Like, if you're trying to say, okay, you need to rework your story to do this, you're kind of clarifying things in your own mind about, the certain rules and ways to approach a situation. So often when I'm working on a different story, by procrastinating, on say another script, it helps me think about, as I'm approaching this, either one from scratch, one inspires the other. So if you're doing say a paid job, and someone gives you a 2 or 3 line idea, and they're like, okay, we want you to build a world. You start having to ask certain questions, when you start to make sure that world is full, to make sure that the arc that the character is going on is fully realized. And by doing that, it kind of sometimes sparks, oh, wait, in White Ash, I still need to answer those questions. And so you go and you write those down. And what started out as just trying to answer, a quick question, all of a sudden you've lost an hour. Yeah.
Just going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, definitely one informs or inspires the other, and it's not always just, a warm up. It's just an exploration of an idea in one will inspire a solution for the other.
Now, how long ago were you thinking about White Ash? Like, when was it a procrastination project?
So, the way I write is probably a little different than the way a lot of different comic book writers write, because I come from a background in screenplays, and also in animation. Like, I've written a lot of different forms, but for me, I like to write the full script first, without worrying about the pages or the panels or things like that. And then I go back, because for me, there's an ebb and a flow to dialogue and to rhythm, um, that I want just to be intrinsic to itself. And then I go back and try to think about how it will work as a comic.
Mm.
And what's the best way to break that up into a comic book. So I originally wrote White Ash as just a script, just to have the dialogue play out, to have the scenes play out. And then I started thinking, okay, now that I have this thing that's fully realized, how do I make it work for the medium of comics? And that's a very specific process, because every medium that you write for is different. But if you're writing something to write it, to have the story down, that basic story, in terms of the ebbs, the flows, where the beats are, like, once you have that, I think you can transpose it to any
Mm-hmm.
medium, no restrictions and the advantages that different mediums have. But but having that story is the most important piece, versus writing for page turns, or writing for 22 pages. Like I was fortunate because I was writing for myself, when I started White Ash. And so I wasn't worried about where constructs that a publisher was going to put on me in terms of how long a page, an issue should be. So I was writing for the story.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was able to kind of look at what I had written and say, okay, how does this best work as a comic book series? So in answer to your question, the first script for White Ash was probably done around end of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And like the first piece of script, and then then it was working into a comic book universe, and figuring out how best to do that. And so that was for about half of 2017, and then finding Conor and putting the team together that would best support the vision we were trying to do for the book.
And how did you find your creative team?
Using the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Using the internet, and also, I have connections. So it was when I was vetting the samples that I put a post in a couple of different places, and I would do this differently now because I'm much more plugged into where to find artists, where to find colorists, where to find letterers now than I was, say, 3 years ago. So back then I posted, like, I had read this great website which is filled with all kinds of information, and he had one big blog post, where to find an artist. And so I had posted, I think, on Reddit and Pencil Jack and DeviantArt, and I got somewhere around 120, 130 responses from pencils because I was offering. I had done a good write-up to make the book seem appealing, and I said I was offering money. So that those two things got me a really good response rate. And then it was just digging through those submissions. And one of my oldest friends, who I met back in animation, he's a big storyboard director and animation director, and he's worked on all kinds of things from Bob's Burger to Hellboy to Tron's Legacy to one of the Spider-Man shows to Black Dynamite. So he sat down with me and we looked over my 30 favorite, and really easy for him to be like, oh wait, no, this is not one artist, tending to be one artist, that he could just tell from looking at them. Which is one of the disadvantages. Like, a lot of people go and try to find the cheapest artist they can work with, and that's often overseas, but you don't really know what's going on. And so for me, I wanted to make sure I had a relationship with whoever I was working with, and it wasn't going to be done through a translator or through an overseas company, just so I knew what I was getting. But when he saw Conor Hughes, who's the line artist in White Ash, when he saw his work, my friend said, no, stop looking. This is the guy. You don't need to look anywhere else. Look at his storytelling. It's so good. And it just jumped off the page, and I knew right away that that he was the partner that I had been looking for the book.
Mm-hmm. And what was the fantasy genre? The genre that you wanted to start off with first?
For writing comics, or just in general?
Yes.
So I think for me, the fact that White Ash is fantasy is indicative of a lot of things I write, where I don't write a lot of straight genres. Like, White Ash is not a high fantasy story set in a universe that you've never seen before. I like to take things that are set in the real world and add twists to them, whether it's sci-fi or fantasy or just something magical. I like that a character who's been existing in an everyday life finds out there's something more. Because I think for me, that's kind of a core journey that I've been on, that I think a lot of us have been on, is to see what else is out there. When you come from a small town, you're like, this can't be it. There's got to be something more. And I think then you go to a big city and you're like, this is great. And after a couple of years, you're like, there's got to be something more. Maybe that something more is family. Maybe that something more is religion, depending on who you are. I think we as humans are looking for a quest for meaning. And I just like finding stories that are rooted in that sense of mundane universe where your world is expanded. So I think like all of the things that I've written are usually a hybrid of genres. So, well, White Ash is fantasy. It's also romance. It's got a little bit of comedy in it, and it's hard to genre mix because if you don't have the tone just right, it just comes across as silly or unrealistic. Right amount of all of those elements, so they feel like they're in their own universe. And so I think when you're doing that, you have to have a really good sense of the universe that you're building. And so for me, the key to that is also going slowly. It's not you have a character and a gigantic spaceship crashes down and everything changes instantly. It's, you slowly start seeding of seeing the second part of the world that they never knew existed.
Yeah, I guess I can sort of understand the sort of slow build. I mean, I don't know if you've watched The Mandalorian yet.
I have. I've watched a bunch of those.
Well, there's a lot of people out there who are complaining that it's too slow, but I appreciate the slow build of the story.
So I'm really conflicted about The Mandalorian because I enjoy it, but I think it has a slow build that it only gets away with because it's set in the Star Wars universe. And I think that there's a lot of buy-in that we all have already established with those characters. Like with Yoda, with the suit of armor, we already have a relationship, so we're willing to go along with a slower journey that I don't think people would be willing to go along with if those tropes, if those things that they didn't already have a relationship with weren't there. And so I do like a slow build, but I feel like in terms of the way this slow build has been building, it's cheating a lot.
I see. I can see that. I can see that.
But I enjoy it, and I want to see more Baby Yoda. I want to see more of that universe, but I don't know how much has actually happened over the first 4 episodes at all. That's, versus like something like Watchmen, which is one of the most intricate, layered shows that's on television right now. So, I think 2 very different approaches were like that a completely built universe, which again is not necessarily the way I write most stories, but I really appreciate that.
I wonder if it's due to because they have different directors doing each episode. So I don't know if there's, I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
With The Mandalorian?
Yeah, with The Mandalorian.
I mean, I'm sure it's. Look, I think Jon Favreau wrote the whole thing, right? So he is the overall visionary of it. And that's the story that he wants to tell at the pace that he wants to tell it. So, it's working. People love it. Like I said, I enjoy it. But sometimes I look at it and I think if you are a young writer who's just starting to tell a story, it's not giving you the best lessons. Because I think you can tell a story slowly and you can lay out a story slowly, but you need to give people, in my opinion, a little bit more about who that character is, who are some of the other characters in that universe. Because, if you take like the first 3 episodes, which is basically an hour and a half movie, 4 characters. Right. So again, you can go slowly, but if we flesh that out a little bit more, again, if you weren't in a Star Wars universe, if you only met 4 characters over the course of an hour and a half, you're either watching the most indie movie, like it's The Station Agent, like with a budget of $100,000, they couldn't afford any other actors. Or no one's watching it. So, again, it works. but it's
Which is funny because I think the budget per episode is what, 15 million. I
yeah,
think is that
yeah,
what it was?
crazy. It's a crazy budget, but in terms of characters that talk, in terms of characters whose faces you see, like, and you haven't learned that much about any of the characters except for flashes. Who were a young student who's in college who's looking to be a writer, looking at that and breaking down the story beats as a way to structure your first series. I'm just saying it's not the way to go.
All right. Now we can shift back to White Ash. I mean, you said it's not just a fantasy; it's also romance. Let's talk about the two main characters, Alec and Lillian. I'm curious, when you were thinking about White Ash, did you start off with character development first, or how far along the process was that? Because I mean, the characters are pretty. I mean, they're really well thought out and they balance each other pretty well.
I like to take a holistic approach sometimes when I'm writing something. In trying to, I started with the world, and then the characters were just people to exist in the world, and I
Mm-hmm.
really liked building intricate worlds. And I would have a story, and then it's like, oh, who are the characters that support that story? And as I got older and I wrote more things, I started realizing, you couldn't, it's chicken and the egg, and you needed to have both together. For me, the dynamic of their relationship, the reason, that they have a forbidden romance between the two, that was, the original impetus for the series. It was like, oh, what if we had a relationship between these two characters? I feel like I've seen that before, but I really haven't. And I want to write a story about those characters. And then, I wanted to set it in our world, and then I wanted to them to tell that story. But at its core, I knew there was going to be a little bit of a forbidden romance between the two. Um, and then when I'm writing anything, it's not just about the main characters. It's about how are the side characters going to cause complications for the main characters. What are their stories, and so it's not just 2 or 3 episodes. Like I plot out big arcs so I can see the ebb and flow of a relationship and how that's going to tie into the narrative. So with Alec and Lillian, I have their relationship plotted out so certain moments in their relationship will coincide with certain moments of narrative storytelling. So, a big turning point in that relationship will coincide with the end of one story arc, or it might be the impetus for another one to kick off. And I think the important thing when you're writing something that's serialized, that's going to be ongoing, is you need to find organic ways to change the nature of those relationships. Because if you have, it doesn't matter how great your universe is, if people don't want to see characters interacting in that universe, they're going to get bored. And so you need to have characters who have a fluid dynamic with their relationship. That can't be static. That also has to evolve. So if you can think about where your story is going and think about what are the different points in the relationship that these people are going to go through, and then try to tie those together, you're just giving more weight to both aspects of the story. So that's kind of like I plot both of those things out. I think about where is their relationship going to get complicated? How can I change those complications? So it won't just be a linear path of they meet each other, they get together, and they live happily ever after. Like their relationship will go through lots of different ebbs and flows, and there are story points that are set to come down the future that will organically add complications to the dynamic of their relationship.
Yeah, I'm still looking forward to everything that is going to be happening in volume 2, because you set something up. You set a lot of things up that I'm waiting to see how they sort of go into and come to the fruition. How far have you actually planned out the whole series? Have you planned out the ending?
Yeah. I mean, I think for the best movies, for the best TV shows, things like whatever you're looking at, the best comics, the beginning of the hero's journey in some ways will inform the end. and so you shouldn't see that until the series ends, but then in retrospect, it should feel like one cohesive narrative. So to that end, I have a lot of like I have a big overall arc. I know where the series ends roughly. I have mapped out a lot of what happens to different individual characters. I have a very detailed outline for what would probably be 5 of the trades that you've read. And then beyond that, I have a loose outline which has the story beats for probably another 6 to 10 trades. So like I always say roughly it's about a 60 issue story. And I have, but with anything, you have to be cognizant that at some point people might lose interest in the series, that something could happen to, my desire to tell it or Connor's desire to tell it. So it has some natural endpoints that I could truncate it if needed, but it's kind of mapped out for about 60 issues.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to the ride.
Thank you.
Now, let's sort of switch gears and talk about the business side of the comic book creation process. You were initially self-published, and now you've sort of found, I guess, Scout Comics. I mean, how did that process go about?
Well, I think we're in a really interesting time right now for comic books, in that there's a lot of people who are self-publishing. There's a lot of smaller publishers. And but the same issue is facing everyone, that because there's so much content out there, the overall number of sales of issues is still quite high, but the individual sales of titles is getting lower, and it's really hard to support. Like, I was just talking a second ago about doing 60 issues. That's a really hard thing to find any company that's going to be willing to support. If you're pitching a mini series, like, you need to basically be pitching a mini series to a publisher if you want some publisher to pick you up and pay for it. They're not going to do an ongoing series from an unknown. Probably not going to do an ongoing series from most regular creators unless you are incredibly well known in the comic book. Like Mark Millar can go into anywhere and say, "Hey, I have this idea for an ongoing series," and they're going to say, "Okay, let's see how it goes." But aside from that level of creator, we're in a really tough time. I mean, you have like there was a lot of controversy lately on Twitter about piracy, which was kicked off by Crowded.
I was about to ask you about that.
Yeah.
That one thread that you.
Yeah, and I think with something like Crowded talking about how their individual issues are down to about 3,000 or 4,000 per copy, they aren't generating enough income to continue the series as a monthly issues, in terms of monthly issues. So Image is going to turn it into graphic novels going forward if they want to continue that storyline. The problem with doing a graphic novel is that front loads a lot of the cost on the creative team, and there's a lot more risk involved in terms of if you want to pay the artist a living wage, and assuming the writer's paying for it, or even if everyone's doing it on equity. I mean, the amount of time that it takes to do 120 page or 130 page graphic novel, I mean, that could be half a year for a comic artist, and they're banking on income they're hoping on getting, but they don't know what their sales are going to be. So it's a really difficult time to finance comics, but it's a great time for reading comics because there's a lot of content coming out. It's just there aren't a lot of new ongoing series that are going to last for a long time because the dollars aren't there to support it. So you don't see a lot of things on, even like, a lot of people look at Image as the gold standard, and I think in terms of deals for creators they are, but you don't see a lot of new series again that aren't from Mark Millar or someone really well known that go beyond 6 or 12 issues. Because once the speculator market dies off, then the issue sales just aren't there. And I think Crowded said they started with 20,000, and then they quickly dropped after the first issue. I'm looking at the numbers of what single issue sales were and thinking about how much I would be getting back from a publisher, and realizing that, there was just no way to tell this story if I went, the traditional route of having a publisher pick up the cost, because, they would just cancel the series before we had a chance to get it off the ground. Which is where Kickstarter comes in, which is where White Ash started, and we built a really good audience. With Kickstarter, you're basically marketing directly to an audience. You're cutting out Diamond, but you also don't have, you don't necessarily end up in comic book shops. So for me, I was kind of looking at a path where maybe, in an ideal world, I could kickstart things, and serve that audience, and then find a way to also find a publisher to serve a different audience, but not be so dependent on the publisher for financing. And that's kind of the deal that I've ended up with Scout, where we're doing different versions of White Ash for Scout, but I'm able to keep financing the book going forward on Kickstarter, which ensures that, as long as the Kickstarter audience keeps coming, I can afford to keep making the book, and then hopefully, we can reach a second audience through the retail market, and be able to keep putting it there for those people as well. And so it's just like looking at it, like,
I see.
there's different markets. There's an international market. There's a digital download market. I just look at Kickstarter as a separate market for a separate group of people, and if we can just use that market to to help finance it being put in other markets, then I can keep making the book for a long time, which is really the goal. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. And speaking of Kickstarter, I mean, how were you able to grow your fan base so quickly?
Well, so I'll start by saying I've been really lucky. I think Kickstarter can be an incredibly difficult place. And I think, the fact that I'm working with Conor and Fin Cramb, who does the colors for White Ash, we have a really good looking book. So that's helped. People like what we're doing in terms of the writing, so that helps. But I think, so if we want to get into Kickstarter, I think the keys for Kickstarter are: you have a good product, you seem like someone people want to invest in, and you seem like you're going to deliver the product. If you have those three things, then you're going to have a certain base level amount of success. And then it's about delivering or over delivering on what you initially promised, which gets people to come back for your next one. And then if you keep doing that, you start building a relationship, and your Kickstarters get bigger and bigger and bigger. So, my first one was fairly successful, and they've ramped up since then. So, we're at the point now where we fund on the first or the second day for most of the Kickstarters that we're doing. But it's because we built up equity with the backers. They know the level of product that we're going to deliver. And we do deliver. And we have a relationship with them. We keep in contact with them. I try to do lots of updates. If someone asks a question, I try to respond usually within an hour, within a couple of hours. I know a lot of creators get nervous and they ghost people. If you have a delay, you just let people know.
Right.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so that's very true. I mean, I've known some other projects that that they were expecting a delay, and they let their audience know, and the audience was cool with that. They had no problem with waiting for a little bit longer for their product.
Yeah, I mean, things happen. I mean, we've been really good with White Ash. I have a new series that I just launched a couple of months ago with Conor called The Game. We were mostly done with the book when we launched, and then Conor was going to finish it up right after that, and then he had a whole bunch of family issues that hit him, and it's just made it really difficult for him to to get back on the schedule where he needed to finish the book. And we've tried to be really upfront with that. But I've also, I feel like if you look at yourself when you're self-publishing, you have to hold yourself accountable. So, we're going to be later with this than I wanted to. And it's from factors that are completely out of control that we couldn't have planned for. But we're going to make it up to people. We're going to give everyone who backed the first book a PDF of the second book. So we're trying to find ways to not only say, hey, we know we're being delayed on this, but we're going to make it up to you, which I think also helps build equity as well.
Awesome. And to the Hall H show audience, I haven't known Charlie for too long, but it seems like, I don't know, you're just somebody that I can sort of like, I can hear you. I can hear the sincerity in your voice, and whatever you say, I'm like, okay, I'm all in.
I appreciate that. I mean, like, look, I think when you're trying to create something, you have to be a bit of a salesman.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes that can create a wall of artifice. I mean, and everyone has their salesman persona.
Sure.
Some people get really loud. Some people are really hooky. My shtick is I try to be sincere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like,
it comes through. I mean, and even when I'm talking to, even at a show, like I last saw you at was it Golden Apple Comics in LA. It's like we talked for a little bit, and it was like having a conversation like we're having right now. And I mean, I value every interaction that we've had so far.
No, me too. Thank you. I mean, I think it's also with comics, there's a real community there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to become part of that community, you have to be part of that community, right?
Right.
And you have to contribute. You have to give back. I feel really lucky that I've been embraced by people very quickly coming back to comics. I mean, I have a big background in comics, and but I had been out of comics for a long time. I really appreciate how lots of other creators who do Kickstarters or who are at smaller publishers have reached out to me with advice, have been willing to share that with me. So, like, you want to give back. And I'm fortunate and unfortunate to have been part of a lot of other different types of aspects of the entertainment industry. And it's not the same in other places. I would say anime is the closest in terms of having some kind of community, a brotherhood, a sisterhood, however you want to phrase it. But, with features, with TV, I mean, some of that stuff gets a little bit more cutthroat. There's a lot more jealousy there. I think partially because there's so much more money involved. With comics, everyone knows this is a labor. At the end of the day, if you're not losing money, you're winning. And so anyone who's willing to sort of get into that crazy pursuit, your heart goes out to them. You want to help them. And you want them to be able to make the best version of the thing they want to make.
And case in point, I think it was LA Comic-Con. You weren't just in one, but you were in two Kickstarter for comic book panels. So that just goes to show you that people value your opinion on when it comes to comic books.
Well, I think it's also because, like, and this is what I say. I mean, like, I don't have a big, I'm not one of those people with 15,000 or 10,000 Twitter followers. When I started kickstarting my comic, or the same number of Facebook friends, I probably had 300 or 400 people that were following me on Twitter, and 3 or 4, maybe 300 people on Facebook, and that was about it. And so on Kickstarter and really expand my Facebook, I'm not Facebook, but Twitter and just like my social media profile through Kickstarter, through making comics. And I think that for a lot of people is the goal. They want to create something and they want people to find it, and they want it to get easier as they go forward. And that for me has been the experience. So, what I can do to share that with other people, I'd love to be able to help them.
Awesome. Why don't we take a break and we'll do a thunder round, sort of our off the beaten path set of questions. Sure. All right. And the first one is, what color best describes you, and why did you pick that color?
Color. Okay. I'm going to go with green because my daughter thinks it's my favorite color. It's not really, but when you have children, you have to make lots of concessions. And so because it makes her happy, I go with green. So I think, like finding ways to make other people happy, again, goes back to my brand. It works with my children really well. So
Awesome. Would you rather be an elf or dwarf in the White Ash universe, or something else?
it's a really hard one. I think I would rather be an elf,
Mm-hmm.
but I like the dwarves better.
What is it about the elves that you like?
I feel like the elves have more upside, uh,
Uh,
and they have a longer lifespan to be
right.
able to achieve, achieve that. But with the elves, you have to. It's a very tricky walk because with near immortality, because goes hand in hand with an arrogance where you think you're better than everything else because
Right.
you basically are. So you have an eternity to get it right. It's just a question of whether you think it's a slippery slope, but you have a better chance to do good things with your life versus being a dwarf where you just get to enjoy and live for the moment.
It's sort of akin to, I think I was talking to Rylan, and he said that, if we all had superpowers, we'd be assholes.
Yeah,
But
no, like I think that's it. Like I mean, there's I'm looking to do a spin-off of White Ash, which centers on Lillian's mother, and part of it is because they have such long lifespans. If you're looking at someone's arc, it's okay. This is what's going to happen over 3,000 years. They're going to go from feeling like they are this invulnerable, godlike creature to feeling a little bit more human and understanding their place and how what they do affect other people. Um, and so that's kind of the arc I'm looking at with her, but it goes kind of hand in hand with your lifespan and what things that you will experience over the course of your life and when.
I'm happy to hear you say that because her character, I mean, she's pretty badass.
Yeah, yeah. This is so that comic which I'm writing right now, and I have an artist, or I have a couple of artists. I'm just trying to decide who would be best for it.
Mm-hmm.
Will actually take place about 3,000 years ago and in 1970s New York, and it's going to go back and forth between the two zones, with a young woman in 1970s New York who starts having flashback memories to Galarian 3,000 years ago. And over the course of the miniseries, we'll see how the two of them are actually tied together.
Ah, interesting. All
Because I
right.
think the core with White Ash is, it's high fantasy, but it's set in the real world. So I just did, and I'm not saying I'm not opposed to it. If I just did I like to describe that character as an elven red Sonya. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
if I just did that in the elven fantasy universe, it would be a really fun story. But to me, it doesn't feel like it necessarily is a White Ash story, because White Ash is also grounded in our world a little bit, so it needs to tie in.
Mm-hmm.
So,
What book or movie would you recommend to your 15-year-old self?
well, my 15-year-old self would be just sitting on Disney Plus and shotgunning the Marvel Universe saga again and again, because when I was 15,
Uh,
we had the really bad version of the Fantastic Four that was never released.
oh yeah, that's right.
Like that. Those were the level of Marvel movies that I was getting. Um, so like my 15-year-old me would just be really happy about the quality and level of content that was coming out.
Uh-huh.
Um, I would say Groundhog Day,
Uh-huh.
because that had not come out yet. I mean, there's a couple of films that I like to think of as perfectly written films. Back to the Future is another one.
Mm-hmm.
So as an aspiring writer creator at the time, like those would be some things that if my 15-year-old self hadn't already seen one or two of them a couple of times, I would say, watch these.
Awesome. Now, since you come from a movie background and you for sure love the Marvel MCU, I mean, what did you think about Martin Scorsese's comments?
Well, I think you have to take them in context. And the context is that he's an old man.
Hmm.
And I think for all of us, when we get older, we're not as flexible with our thoughts. And throughout time, there's been, there's kind of a tradition of creators not understanding the next generation. And if you go back, someone had a great thread about this when they were just talking about you can find criticism, people who were criticizing Scorsese in the 70s who thought he was too, you know, taking too many liberties with the form. And you have Hitchcock criticizing Peckinpah, and you've got John Ford criticizing Hitchcock, and you've got Orson Welles criticizing John Ford. So I don't think this is anything new. I don't think you have to put any more weight on it because it's Scorsese. He's a guy who's in his 70s, and these are not films for him, and that's okay.
Hmm.
Um, I like a lot of the stuff that Scorsese's done, but also remember, some of his BFFs are people like George Lucas. So, I mean, at times it's a little hypocritical, but I'm not going to hold that against Scorsese for seeing something that he doesn't like or he can't appreciate. I mean, I already see that with music. I think music moves a little bit faster than film, and there's lots of forms of music that I just don't quite get, and they aren't things that I would say are per se bad, but they're just not for me. And I think, especially if you're a creator, you have to remember, we're influenced by the things that come before us, but we might not understand the things that come after us. And so being part of that continuum is good, and maybe not commenting too much on, things that come after you. I mean, I think it's different if you're commenting about something that, say, crosses a line in terms of being offensive to a group or a subset of people. I think taking a stand on something is different than criticizing a genre for being a certain type of genre.
Those are all good points. And speaking of music, let's just say you're closing down a karaoke joint, and you get to sing the last song. What song would it be?
Uh, I used to like do a version of Midnight Oil's "Beds Are Burning."
Okay.
I would do a version of the Love Shack. I think I also, if you look hard enough, you can find the little clips of me here and there as an actor from when I first moved out to Los Angeles. So I like to do songs where I could put on a voice, make an effective voice, and ham it up, rather than actually trying to hit the notes, which I knew was an exercise in futility.
Awesome. If you were president of the United States, what kind of artwork would you hang up in the Oval Office?
Oh, uh, I think right now I'd start with a big blow up of the Constitution and highlight certain points, because I think we're in a really difficult time right now. But after that,
Definitely a precarious point in our time right now.
it's an interesting time. I think we're in and like I optimistically like to see it as we are in. We've been in a culture clash for a long time, but there's one side that I think is kind of in its death rattle, and it's lashing out, because I don't think it's going to be around in the future just based on demographics and where people are evolving to, but
Right.
they're going to make it really difficult before they die out and disappear. But back to your less political question of what I would hang in the White House. Uh, you know, I like photography. I would probably have some black and white photography there. I like things with contrast. I might have uh, you know, some old Will Eisner. I love Will
Hmm.
Eisner. Um, I think, yeah, maybe get a Rembrandt in there. I actually really liked his pen and ink work. Looked like it's really interesting. It's kind of some of his brush and figure work look, it's borderline cartoony. And when I
Mm.
mentioned that when I was in college to my art history professor, that I thought if Rembrandt had been alive today, he would have been a comic book illustrator. Um, this rather stuffy man, I almost had a heart attack. This was back before there had been any crossover where people were starting to think of comics as art. And so, yeah, like the fact that I would say that one of the greatest artists of all time would dare do comic book art was crossing a line for him.
um, and my last question for the Thunder Round is, what's one thing your fans would be surprised to learn about you?
What would be one thing my fans would be surprised to learn about me? The whole It's like what would be surprising. That's the real rub. Um, I used to teach fencing
Oh, wow.
um, way back in the day. So that maybe that's a little bit of a different bent, but my interest in fencing started from watching Star Wars.
There you go.
Uh, I was a fencer in high school and a little bit in college, and I used to teach fencing in the summer at a day camp for gifted and talented kids.
Oh, wow. That's pretty fascinating. I don't know if you're familiar with Bruce Lee at all.
Sure.
I know that in his formulation for his style of Jeet Kune Do, he was interested in fencing as well because of the sort of like using the fence, but the sort of application of a fast jab. So he was really interested in fencing.
Well, I think one of the nice things about fencing is that it's about speed and precision
Hmm.
versus necessarily brute force or even athletic ability. And there's a little bit of a chess match aspect to it, where if you can outthink your opponent through thrusts and jabs and parries, and you're setting up a rhythm. I also used to play the something with fencing and I think with some martial arts where
Hmm.
you set up a rhythm, and then you break that rhythm to throw your opponent off.
Right, right, right. Sort of
Uh,
like how boxing is.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
They think it's going to be jab, jab, cross, and then it's jab,
Mm.
jab, cross, cross. They
And
might not be ready for the second cross.
yeah, and you mentioned parry, and the I think um, Jeet Kune Do actually means way of the intercepting fist. So his philosophy was a parry and a strike at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like that's the thing with fencing. I mean, it's parry, parry, riposte. Your attack might not be predicated upon your attack. Your attack might be just something to elicit an attack that you can turn into a counterattack. And so, I was rather small when I was in middle school and in high school before, gaining the truly massive stature of 5'8" that I am now. But before that, I was rather small, and so, for me, while I loved sports, finding sports that I could compete at, where my size wasn't a detriment, was difficult for me, and so fencing was definitely one of those.
Awesome. Okay, let's switch back to your I guess your projects. You mentioned the game earlier. Is there anything else that you want to sort of add to that?
So the game is a sci-fi tale. It's about again, it follows that same kind of trope of someone discovering their life isn't what they seem when on Eli's 30th birthday he realizes that there are these numbers that are starting to coalesce in front of him, and that a score is being kept for every action that he does. And he, for some reason, has been mistaken for player number 3 in a game that's been played for over 1,000 years.
Wow.
And going forward, there are other players that recognize him as this, and he needs to kind of catch up to what's happening and if not, it's going to have dire consequences for him. So that's like the basic storyline for that. But it's, again, someone who's been realizing that there's so much more than they ever thought, and having to react to those new circumstances and become a better person to deal with the fallout from that.
Mm-hmm. And besides White Ash and Game, are there any other projects that you have in the pipeline?
So, like I said, I have a White Ash spin-off that I am looking to do. I am consulting on another project that I'm not at liberty to talk about right now, but that's actually for another publisher that's hired me to work on that.
Oh, wow.
So, that might be coming down the line, at which point I'd be happy to talk about that. And, I have a big library of things I would like to put into motion. Some are in ideas and some are in more fuller script stage. But I think it's important, especially if you're self-publishing, not to move too quickly. Because you want to build up, again, equity with people who are buying your books. And you want to make sure they're enjoying what you're doing before you launch something new. Because and you also only have so much time. Like right now, running Kickstarters and also doing a lot of the publicity for the Scout launch of White Ash, which is coming out January 29th. It takes up a lot of time and bandwidth, which doesn't leave as much time to being creative as you would like. But these are, you have to understand it's part and parcel of the creative process of writing the stories, that you have to let people know that you have a story that they want to read.
Well, I mean, it seems like you have a lot of the stuff that you're juggling, and on top of that, I mean, you're raising.
Really? No. I mean, like, I have a giant wall calendar. I have a computer calendar, and they all have lots of Post-its and notes about when I'm supposed to be starting what, and then they keep getting pushed. And I think if you're attempting to do a lot, it's just important to have a game plan that you can attempt to achieve. I've also been working as a writer or some other form of self-employment for a good 15 years, maybe. And so for me, I mean, that's, again, like, if that's the lifestyle that you're going to choose, you need to get good at budgeting your time. When my kids were really little, I would, find ways to write in a 15-minute increment when they were taking a nap. And, you have to, like, you don't have the 2 hours that you had when you were 20 something to, like, surf the internet or find the right piece of music before you can get writing. You just have to jump into it, and you have to be ready to work when those windows arise. So, there's a certain amount of necessity, but I think for me, it's definitely, like, I have big lists of to be done, and things that I'm trying to do, and and things that I really want to do at some point in the future, and we'll see if they happen.
Awesome. Speaking about the future, I think you just got small press for San Diego Comic-Con 2020.
Yeah. We I just sent off the check today, so I will be back in small press in San Diego, L10. I am also planning on being in WonderCon in Anaheim in late April. They haven't sent out the notices yet for that. I think they deal with Comic-Con first, because it's the same company. Mm-hmm. I am looking at possibly also doing Rose City Comic-Con. I just need to decide if I want to make that trip. And I may do Comic-Con Ontario. Most of the conventions I do are LA centric, because with my kids, again, you just don't want to travel too far. But we did have a presence. Actually, White Ash had a presence at New York Comic-Con this year, because Scout has a booth there. And
cool.
was signing a New York Comic-Con exclusive of the new White Ash. So, hopefully between the two of us, we can start doing more conventions around the country, start upping the profile of the different projects that we're working on.
So that was, is it Comic-Con Revolution in Ontario? Is that what it was?
Yeah. So I'm
Okay.
thinking about that. Again, it's I think with all of these conventions, you have to decide whether the numbers work for you, whether, some of it, like I've been to, this will be my third year having a booth at San Diego.
Hmm.
And having a booth at San Diego is not necessarily about making money. There's a lot to be said for just the face time that you have for being there. You can make back your table fee fairly easily. It's
Yeah.
just the hotels that are so expensive if you don't live in San Diego. Uh, I think like the cheap hotels that you look at for the most part start around 200 a night.
Hmm.
If you're looking at going down, you're going to be there for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So you at least got 4 nights of hotels, maybe 5 nights of hotels. So like I said, it gets really expensive. So your overhead might be close to $2,000 for that show.
Right. It can definitely get up there, and you're not even talking about food and drink.
No, no. So so that's a really expensive show to do. Um, but I think it's really worth it if you're looking to make a name for yourself and meet other people.
Hmm.
So I love the show. I'm really glad to have been there the last couple of years, and hopefully we'll make some money this year.
Awesome.
It's also hard to make money if you're just selling floppies versus having a trade, books that you can push. And this year we'll have at least one book that we'll be able to sell there.
Yeah. Speaking of other people, obviously we can't do the things that we do without a little help. We have a segment of the podcast called Superhero Shoutouts. I'll give you this opportunity to sort of give a shout out to somebody or a group of people out there who've helped you along the way.
Well, I just want to start quickly by saying Conor Hughes and Fin Cramb, who are my partners on White Ash. I think Conor does the art and the letters for the book. Fin Cramb does the colors. And I wouldn't have been able to get anywhere if it were not for them. I think Ryland Grant has been very helpful to me in terms of navigating the convention scene. Same thing with David Schrader, introducing me to a lot of different people. Um, Emily Pearson, who is an artist who does a lot of work for Vault and Black Mask. She really introduced me to a lot of young artists. That's been really helpful, and she's great. Just a lovely person. I would also say, in terms of Kickstarter, there's been a couple of people who have really helped me navigate those waters. And it'd be Tyler James, who has his Comic Launch podcast, Madeline Rosling, who does Boston Metaphysical, and Ray Chow, who does Skies of Fire. So that's my very quick shout out. I mean, there's a lot of other people who have been very helpful, and they'll probably get off this and think, "Oh, I should have said so and so."
Well, we'll have to have you on again, and I'll give you another opportunity to give those guys a shout out too.
I would also say, like if you live in Los Angeles, you're really lucky because there's some amazing comic book shops that are very open to helping creators get started.
And not to mention, you mentioned Ryland Grant, David Schrader, yourself. I mean, there's just a really awesome comic book community up there.
Yeah, there really is, and and there's one thing to have the community, but it's another to have the community be visible.
Mm-hmm.
And we have there's an LA based comic book creators get together that happens maybe once every month and a half or so, which is great. That Andrew Maxwell, who just did Rum Rolling Kickstarter, put together. But like shops like Golden Apple and Heidi Ho and the Comic Bug, who really just put a lot of creator events together, also help.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Hey, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on the show. Is there anything that we missed that you'd like our audience to know about?
Like I said, aside from going to your comic book shops on January 29th to pick up the first issue of White Ash and tell them you want the second one, company, very often the comic book shops, when it comes to the smaller press, do not order number twos or order 1 or 2 number twos. So if you like it, get to your shop and tell them right away that you want number 2 for a series. And you'll help, if not me, that you'll help your favorite new title actually get to a third issue.
Awesome. Where can people find you online?
I believe I'm at Charles Stickney at Twitter. on Twitter, and that's basically the comic.com webpage. Webpage, yes. um, and those are probably the two best. We also have a White Ash Comic Instagram, which I'm still figuring out. I'm only marginally better at it than Conor is, who's rubbish for being an artist. He really needs to get better. I think he has like 6 posts. But Twitter is mostly where I hang out. And people, if you have questions about Kickstarter or small press or self-publishing, please feel free to hit me up. I'm always happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely have to have you on again. This has been an awesome conversation. Lots of gold nuggets here for our audience to sort of enjoy and learn from.
Anytime. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I guess we'll close out the show. Thank you so much for tuning into the Hall H Show podcast, where we love showcasing independent creators like Mr. Charlie Stickney. If you believe in our mission to be the voice of independent creators, we would love a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and a comment on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please share our episodes using the hashtag HallHShow. Peace, cheers, and if you would like to recommend a guest for our show, please reach out to us on any of our social media accounts or our website, hallh.com.